Ms. Freelick, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. Could you tell us a bit about what the situation on the ground is like?
Thank you, Alexis. Recently, Hamas launched missiles from the Gaza Strip to here in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It was unexpected that missiles would reach these regions, and luckily our defense force is always on the lookout and knew exactly how to respond to this type of incident. People are in shock since missiles haven't reached Jerusalem since the 1970s. Thankfully, casualties were limited to 4 soldiers and 4 civilians.
What action did the government take following the attack?
The cabinet authorized the mobilization of 75,000 reservists, and preparations were made for possible ground assault. The Air Force also carried out various raids targeting Hamas leaders to the Gaza Strip.
What do you have to say about the 103 dead and 720 wounded Palestinians?
The Israeli Defense Force did not set up to injure any innocent civilians, but because of the density of the regions, which is 1.6 million people within 360 kilometers squared, it is hard to avoid collateral damage. Precautions were taken when carrying out the procedure, and the Defense Forces tried to limit the casualties, but by the end of November, over 80 militant sites were targeted, including underground rocket launching sites, smuggling tunnels, and training bases. Command posts and weapon storage facilities were also destroyed.
Is the situation stable at the moment?
Somewhat. Operation Pillar of Defense lasted 8 days from November 14th to the 22nd of last year, ending in a ceasefire that was mediated by Egypt. Recently, there have been some unruly protests in the Gaza Strip and near checkpoints along the West Bank, resulting in isolated skirmishes between rioters and Israeli troops. There have been more drills than usual to prepare for the rocket attacks, but the army remains on high alert and things have quieted down.
Even though the military was not purposely targeting civilians, do you think the overwhelming bombardment of Gaza contributed to the recognition of Palestine as a non-member state of the United Nations? The vote was 138 to 9 in favor of the motion.
The Israeli government has made it clear to the UN determining the Palestinian territories' international status is counterproductive to creating a lasting peace. If the Palestinian people want to discuss their sovereignty, the Palestinian National Authority should negotiate directly with the State of Israel. It is not up to the global community to elevate their status.
Regardless, following the vote, the Netanyahu government has announced to build 3,000 settler homes in Old Jerusalem and West Bank. Isn't this illegal defiance in the face of the international community and courts, which have been condemned the incursion?
Look, this is the fault of the Palestinians giving power to radical Islamists to dictate their actions. In the 2006 Palestinian legislative election, Fatah, a party that actually recognizes Israel's right to exist, lost to Hamas, which has been labeled as a terrorist group by Western powers, including your government. Israel is a country under attack, and these terrorists have fired thousands of rockets at our city. They've openly called for our destruction.
Ms. Freelick, sorry to cut you off, but I have asked a question regarding the legality of the settlements. I understand that this is a most emotional subject, and Hamas has been an instigator, but
Well, we're not talking about the seizure of the land and that does not rightfully belong to us. Our government disputes the claims in the European courts over the accurate boundaries, and this is not some reckless expansion. We're talking about the continued development of suburbs contiguous to Jerusalem. There will be no changes on the map, no changes to the divisions that we formally agreed upon.
On January 22nd of this year, Israel held its parliamentary elections, which saw the right-wing coalition under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu return to power. Some say that this triumph was confrontational headliners in the face of what could become another bloody conflict. Do the results bode well for the region's future?
Democracy has been a victor in these elections, and our nation remains proud to be a strong democracy, one of the few existent in the region, in fact. Call the winners hardliners if you wish, but I remind you that all Israelis want is the right to live in peace in the holy land that is rightfully ours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Freeland.
Shalom. Shanaza, thanks for speaking with us today. How is the situation in Palestine territory since the end of Operation Pillar of Defense?
Well, there have been continuous protests over the last few weeks, with no sign of them giving up. There have been reports of gunfire at several rallies in Gaza and the West Bank, which are being held to demand the release of Palestinian prisoners from the Israeli jails, and in protest of the newly planned settlements. Still, there is a lot of anger due to the Israeli condemnation and of the territories achieving non-member status in the UN last year.
But the Israeli government has denied that there will be a reoccupation of Gaza. Is that not so? Why are protesters instigating violence after the ceasefire and so close to checkpoints near Israeli territory?
Well, these prisoners whose release is being demanded by the protesters were never given fair trials. In addition, the Netanyahu government will be building more settlements, and there are concerns that Israeli troops will help settlers and contractors who are moving further into the West Bank. As you know, the UN has condemned the building of these illegal settlements.
Some say that the Israeli government has expanded construction as a result of the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization going to the UN to gain a non-member status for Palestine. Is there any truth to this statement?
Mahmoud Abbas, who's the democratically elected leader of the PLO and the leader of the Palestine's largest opposition party, had full right to present the motion to the UN. And as I'm sure your viewers know, the motion was ratified by a vote of 138 to 9. And Israel's petty move in provoking us following this achievement will only really result in more violence and can act as a barrier to achieving a lasting peace.
Is it not a double standard to rally against Israeli expansionism when rockets are being fired from Gaza into Israel only a few months ago, and only a few days before the UN vote? Would it have not been wiser to postpone the vote and see to it that the ceasefire had no repercussions?
Just because a few Hamas militants fired primitive rockets at Israel, it doesn't mean that the Palestinian people are to blame. A few extremists shouldn't define our movement for equality.
But the Palestinian people voted for Hamas in the 2006 elections with full knowledge that the international community regards the group as a terrorist entity. Since 2001, 64 Israeli citizens, some as young as 2 years old, have been killed by Hamas rockets. How can you ask people to differentiate between militants and civilians when the kind of violence continues, unchallenged by Palestine civilian leaders in Gaza?
That's not a fair charge. Although Hamas won the election by a few points almost 7 years ago, their vote was almost solely limited to Gaza. The West Bank remains in the hands of Fatah. Fatah recognizes the state of Israel and is not on any terrorist list.
That may be so, but several groups belonging to Fatah's armed wing fought alongside Hamas militants following the rockets attacks against Israel. Fatah terrorists have even claimed responsibility for a bus bombing in central Tel Aviv last November, a few days before Operation Pillar of Defense. 28 people were critically injured. Isn't it unfair to ask Israel not to retaliate in the face of such blatant attacks of civilian populations?
I think we're downplaying why a few Palestinians are committing such acts. The Israeli occupation that supposedly ended in 2005 is essentially still in effect, and the Israeli control on Gaza's border and the West Bank is filled with settlements. To have your entire life controlled by people that have no respect for your existence is just a horrible thing. Israel is driven by nationalism, determined to extend their reach into Palestine and make this region a safe place for Jews only. If the Israeli government would completely withdraw from the territories, strive for a two-state solution, and repatriate evicted Palestinian families with their land, then maybe frustrated groups would not take up arms.
Perhaps putting down the weapons before stipulating those demands would quicken the pace of the peace process.
I'm only trying to explain to Westerners why those weapons were picked up in the first place.
Fair enough. Thank you for your time, Ms. Shanasa.
Salam.